Distinguished guests, faculty colleagues, students, alumni, and friends of the School of Architecture, a very warm welcome to you all on the special occasion of tonight's lecture titled KPF Making. On behalf of the Chinese University of Hong Kong and our School of Architecture, we're grateful for the opportunity to hear very shortly from James von Klemperer of the internationally renowned architectural practice Kohn Pedersen Fox, or KPF. Their globally acclaimed design works are well known and closely followed by many of us in the audience. Before introducing our guest speaker, allow me a few moments to provide the background context to our lecture series this fall term with its theme on the craft and making of architecture. As our architecture students here have heard me voice previously, if not too frequently, there is a famous saying that design is where art and science break even. So by extension, my belief is that architecture succeeds where our left and right brains intersect, where research informs design, where critical thinking leads to creative insight, where craft and making translate design ideas into built realities. Last month, in this very atrium space, our students were inspired by a design exhibition titled KPF Making, featuring 16 projects as case studies that chronicled the complex yet intimate practice of KPF in the selection, manufacturing, and application of materials, while celebrating the role of the architect as design collaborator, technology investigator, and maker. This exhibition represented an important occasion to acknowledge and celebrate over 4 decades of KPF as a leading American firm with its global professional practice at the forefront of the architectural field. So what is the distinguishing excellence of KPF that sets aside this renowned practice from other leading firms? To me, its most remarkable achievement has been their ability to be, in equal measure, consistently successful in both creative design and commercial practice. At the root of their design creativity and professional competence is the commitment to craft, to the making, materiality, and manufacturing of architecture and construction. These qualities were clearly on display in their recent exhibition and will no doubt be thoughtfully presented by tonight's speaker. James von Klemperer is president and design principal at Kohn Pedersen Fox, where he began his career as an architect in 1983 upon completing his education at Harvard, Cambridge, and Princeton. His design work has ranged in scale from a house to a city, and he contributes closely to these commissions from design concept to their built completion. In addition to his own design projects, Jamie leads a staff of 600 in 6 offices around the world. A major focus of his design work has been the role that large buildings play in making urban space. In Asia, those projects include the China Resources headquarters in Shenzhen, Plaza 66, and Jing'an Kerry Center in Shanghai, China Central Place in Beijing, and the 123-story Lotte World Tower in Seoul, among others. At the larger scale, his design for the new Songdo city in South Korea extends this challenge to the scope of urban planning and design. Jamie has lectured widely at several universities globally, including Harvard, Columbia, Tsinghua, Tongji, Seoul National, and Yonsei universities. And he has taught as the Aero Saarinen Visiting Professor at Yale University. So please join me to extend a warm welcome to James von Klemperer.
Thank you.
Nice to be here.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Nils. Thank you for your generosity in making such a nice introduction and in inviting me and my colleagues Hong Kong is a home for our firm in that we have a wonderful squad of architects over in Central, led by Bernard Chang and by Florence Chan, one of your own now, I understand, teaching here, as well as, so she's running away from our grueling practice every now and then to get a breath of fresh air and do some cogitating, which is wonderful. I should just say something maybe before getting right into the lecture about how our firm and why our firm values the quality of detail, the issues of materials, and the things that architects feel they can get there and need to get their hands on. The firm was founded by three fellows, 1976, Messrs. Cohn, Pedersen, and Fox. And Mr. Fox was a little bit more of a businessman. The other two had their roots in design and maintained their practices as designers. They're still actually working now at ages 88 and 82. But their backgrounds came, Jean was a student of Liu Kahn at Penn. So you can imagine the thinking about units of the smallest possible scale, of the nature of materials somehow determining or inspiring the larger qualities of building. Bill Pedersen from Minnesota came from that environment, studied at MIT, and then worked for Pietro Belluschi, who then did one of the buildings at Lincoln Center, a great kind of, you might say, materially conscious modernist. And then after that for I.M. Pei, where the art of putting together somewhat technical side of curtain walls was elevated to another level. So these two guys maintained their belief that no matter what kind of practice this evolved into, no matter what its scale or range of building types and geographies, that ultimately building was about making things, putting things together. It was about the quality of how buildings could last and how they could serve us as material objects, infused with the spirit of abstract thinking, of form, and all sorts of urban ideas, but ultimately always came back to making things. And as a young architect at the firm, so I more or less started my career at KPF, there were a squad of people who were called themselves senior detailers. And they kind of divorced themselves from the marketing or the drawing or the big thinking, as we thought, about making designs. They were there almost cranking out like a circular printing machine, a spiral roll, detail after detail of how buildings could go together. Something that actually doesn't really survive today. These were hand drawings. And it was a great inspiration and taught us all what we should keep in mind as we move ahead in the practice. So the firm today still makes it the fundamental part of the practice. And it's why a month or two ago, because one of the things I get to do as president of the firm, in addition to my own work, is every now and then to look retrospectively at the work of the whole group. We are a firm of about 25 partners, and of that, maybe you might say 10, 12 of them are design partners. So we're like a 10-engine plane. It's not a 1 or 2 or even 3-person design outfit. And we look at the work of all of these architects and somehow pull the work together. And what are the themes around which one could give a good talk or make a line of argument about our work? And we do a lot of thinking and talking about urban density and large mixed-use projects and the engines of transit-oriented buildings. But the craft of buildings is something that I think, in a way, it somehow eludes you when you think about the work of big firms. But they don't have time for or focus on or care for the detail. And so we want to sort of communicate a little bit how this line of thinking runs through our work. So let me begin a little bit of a bit of history, which is at home in a school. This is some 19th century image of a drafting studio. And we think of architecture, even the making of drawings, as a kind of a crafty process of working with paper, working with implements. These are tools of making things, at least as they were in yesteryear and when I began, and still today, doing my drawing, whatever I do, by hand. rather than by computer. If we think about some of the heroes of the paradigm of the complete architect, we think about Brunelleschi as a person who, especially in his work in the Great Dome in Florence, not only designed the shape of the building, he designed, worked on, thought through the structure, the construction technique, the scaffolding, the winching machines, even the food that the workers consumed and the drink he had figured out, because they would normally drink wine because the water wasn't pure, but if you cut the wine 50%, you could still keep working. And so he decided he would tell the workers what to drink. So that's the complete architect. It's taking craft in a way to an extreme. But his roots were as the maker of bronze, of goldsmithery. His competition application for the baptistry doors in Florence that of course was won by Ghiberti. Fortunately, they saved his entry, even though it didn't get used, but we could see his great skill and care as a sculptor of this kind of relief. And then, the Great Dome, which was a huge, we could say, technological advance for its time, with the use of a parabolic form to span and to hold up. But then, as I mentioned, these are his drawings. They look like Leonardo, but it's actually Brunelleschi's drawings of these machines that would lift the chains that were put around the building to make kind of a tension ring, the tons and tons of bricks that went into the building. So at a certain point, though, as we want to get forward in time so we can talk a little bit about our own work, we have a kind of a conflict that runs through the last at least 5 or 6 centuries of architectural making, of production that begins to be divorced a little bit from creation. We can't all be complete architects who can be masters of all trades, jack of all trades. And so when we think of what production meant in the 19th century with one iteration at least of Industrial Revolution, and this is an English mill where threads were made from cotton, the kind of dulling repetition that machine work brought about in a certain class of people within society had its critics and had its toll on humanity. And there was a sort of, within our field of architecture, a strong push against this kind of dullness of repetition. And so we could say were born various movements, including the arts and crafts movement here, an interior influenced by, if not by, influenced by, let's say, William Morris, where thinking about carpets and tables and joists and patterns all came together in thinking about the world as a whole, and the papers of, this is William Morris, the papers of books, the going backwards in a way in time, a little bit Luddite, a little bit anti-machine, but this was a distinct attempt to recapture the beauty and the importance and the truth of craft. Somewhat fundamental idea, and this ran through Ruskin and Pugin, that if you could make something with your hands, there was some veracity, some integrity, and some higher purpose to it. And so the pendulum swing went back and forth between various movements of thinking about how we could reform our world of making things with machines to making them in a more creative way. And then the forces of industry, of mills, of repetitive buildings and so on. But interestingly, and this is vastly telescoped, so excuse, this is not real history because it's jumping around. We're doing this in 2 or 3 minutes. But Peter Barron's AEG turbine hall, in a way symbolizing or representing a larger group of industrialists and art thinkers, let's say, who thought that the machine was not the enemy of creativity. It could harness, it could free us of various obligations, and it itself could be made into design. The buildings which harbored the machines could be made into design. And so the Werkbund and other German, Austrian versions of this sort of making technology and making the machine into a movement of art progressed to the point where light bulbs were seen as this is a kind of a birth of a certain generation of industrial design that whether they were the sources of Art Nouveau coming into a more modern idiom or other influences that machine making was not exclusive of this kind of artistic input. And then, of course, the Bauhaus was a very, very special coming together of many, many disciplines to think in a systematic way about how the production of household objects, of fabrics and teapots and buildings and many other things could be harnessed to bring the creative mind to the modern society, the modern way of making things. And so the Bauhaus sort of systematized various aspects of education as well as trying to influence the way that society made things. My ancestors were makers of automobiles and locomotives and other sort of factory objects, made objects in Germany. And just a little bit, my own lineage is this background of Bauhaus and a factory strategy. But on the other hand, or one could say at the same, a little later perhaps, the making of furniture in Denmark would, as we all know, the great works of Finn Juhl and Wegener and Mogensen and Kvistgaard. You could make things that had a kind of a super handcrafted intention, but you could make them systematically out of repetitive stockpiling of pieces that would eventually go together. And then this sort of love affair between the machine and the craft. I'm not sure if this is Gropius. It's not Gropius's house in Lincoln. It's about the same period. But you see some of the works of that period of furniture making. So that gave great promise that the modern movement could give us an insight into the finer details of the things that we touch or the things that we use every day. But again, in our pendulum swinging back and forth between hope and despair, we have the world of, a scene from Jacques Tati's Playtime, of the sense of potential alienation. That with these cubicles and this perfect world of squares and corridors made for kind of a mass office work came alienation. And there's Mr. Hulot walking in the middle of these, lost. He's a stranger in a kind of alienated world. And then in the great film, again, Playtime, we see Monsieur Hulot walking along what appears to be a kind of a Park Avenue setting against the grain. He's the man from the village which values handmade cheeses, hand-sewn suits, or clothes with holes in them, just things that relate to your own human qualities, as opposed to the sort of sameness of convention of the suited office worker walking in the other direction. So now we come to the Chinese context, because actually when preparing this lecture, it came simultaneously with some discussions at Tsinghua University, where we have a very nice intern relationship. And so this image of Liang Shecheng and his wife was pertinent because it reminds us, or maybe directs us towards this question of how in the modern day, in the Chinese world, looking backwards at the great heritage of historical buildings and monuments, but at the same time looking forward in Mao's China, we could think about these subjects of making things. There he is with his wife, and his great tome of the history of Chinese architecture, taking great pains to analyze the way that joints are made, and beams and eaves and columns, etc., are creating a kind of art form of construction, and leading to the restoration and rebuilding of some very important buildings. I think this is in Nanjing, but someone who knows better can correct me on that. So that brings us to today and our own little old KPF, which I want to talk about for the next 40 minutes or so. We are somewhat known, these are all Kpf Towers, for buildings that have great height. On this page you see a 400-meter tower is the smallest and a 600-meter tower on the left-hand side of Ping An Insurance. So these structures, the scale of these structures, they constitute about 30% of our work. We also designed everything from the smallest building we designed as a doghouse. It's probably a meter tall. And we rejoice actually in designing smaller buildings where we have the luxury of paying attention to the whole at every aspect of the building. But once you design a tall building, you can't get away from it. You're known for that, and people kind of peg you as the tall building architect. So this is part of the reason for this lecture. We're trying to dispel a potential misreading of our practice and our firm as focusing only on the very, very, very large. The placement of our offices says something about who we are. Our office in Shanghai is within the precinct of Xintiandi, and you can see hovering over some of these smaller concession-era buildings with their terracotta tympana and nice balustrades, 2 hotels, which we designed about 10 years ago. And those hotels have a kind of craft of a larger scale, but fretwork of stone, of granite, of Fujian pink granite, that has a relationship with the way and the strategies of making those little terracotta pieces that adorn the smaller buildings that make this neighborhood of Xintiandi. So now I want to go through 5 or 6 different materials with a project, sometimes 2, but mostly 1 project apiece. This is a little bit following that Bauhaus circle that I showed a minute ago, which was a kind of a dial of the different materials that make up our building world. And they follow, in a way, the evolution of mankind, of womankind. The Bronze Age, the Stone Age, eventually the Steel Age, and the Glass Age, and maybe the Digital Age. But we begin with bronze. So this is just to show you basically what we've been doing and have some insight into how a practice of our kind thinks about and really executes crafted objects. This project is very close to home. Here, this is in Happy Valley, mid-level up, Blue Pool Road. A client of ours, Ronnie Chan of Hang Lung, for whom we designed 5 or 6 buildings already. So it was kind of a nice, familiar relationship, asked us to take a piece of land that was unbuildable because of the way that the grade came very severely down and didn't allow tiebacks necessary to go into the earth until our collaborators and partners from Ronald Liu's office helped us out and figured out how to make that happen. But the building itself, or buildings, a series of row houses, 18 row houses, perched over this very vertiginous retaining wall, is made up of a series of folds of curtain wall, of glass, of triple layer. This is not the subject of this little snippet. I want to talk about bronze, but the glass itself is beautifully crafted. These are CUHK, Gartner wall systems with automated blind mechanisms in between. But the folding had to do with the way that right across the street were some quite sizable buildings, and we needed to deflect the angle of view, as sometimes works in a row house, like a bay window in Back Bay, Boston, or Upper West Side, New York. And so the layers that were put together to make these walls were rather elaborate, and this theme of faceting and angling governed the way in which that wall was composed. Now, on the inside of the project, right up against the hillside, a series of opportunities to make green and work with stone. And in that little alleyway where you arrive at home are some little courtyards, mini courtyards, and entry gates. Those entry gates are bigger than they look. If you see the little wood door in behind one of them, these must be about 3.5 or 4 meters tall. And they make part of a kind of array or a compositional combination of what we think of as primary materials of bronze, wood, and stone. But the bronze screens were really, I would say, the most satisfying part of the project. This was the apex of our experience on this little commission. So these screens are made of, first of all, we had to sculpt them ourselves because we didn't make the bronze. So we made some screens, sculpting them by hand from plaster, essentially. A lot of sculpture starts as plaster. Thinking about these skintled forms of different angles as they reflected an idea that was applied at a larger scale in the building. And of course, we had to think carefully about the angles, the dimensions, the plans, almost like a musical cadence of these waves, angled waves of material, which we intended then to be treated as sculpture. So this is almost to the point where the architecture is gratuitous, where it is an art. You could take the screen off and the house functions fine, but it doesn't really have its spirit. And so, first of all, thinking actually quite early on about the color of the material and how would it be made. So we went to Shanghai, and with the owner we found a foundry that made sand castings where this could be repetitively made. And as the material came, Itak Lau, one of our associates in the firm, was back and forth, almost as if she were sculpting the stuff herself, because the imperfections had to be chased down, sometimes celebrated. And that's, I think, craft work teaches you sometimes that things are better when they're not perfect. And so they were made in a series of 30 or 40 of these at a time, and then delivered down to site. So if you have the opportunity to go up to Blue Pool Road, take a look at these things. They're really for the ages, and nothing to boast about when you're talking about the scale of 400 meter, 500 meter towers, but in a way, just as important for our production as architects, for the satisfaction they give the people who use these places. So to move to brick, another one of our very nice offices outside of New York is in London. In Covent Garden, some of you know the place where the Opera House, formerly the Covent Garden Market, and many kinds of cultural activities take place. We are actually the master planners of this whole formerly ducal estate, Duke of Bedford's estate. The one company owns the whole thing, believe it or not, Capital and Counties. And there's no reason to rebuild Covent Garden, but actually there are many, many little parts that are being improved. In other words, in a smile, let's say, there's one tooth that isn't quite doing very well, so you take it out and put another one in. It's a bad analogy, but it's sort of what we do to Covent Garden. We've done 13 little buildings in this place where, again, why would an architect known for these ginormous projects of urban engines be making a little house? So one of them is actually not a residence, but a commercial building, which you see finished here. But let me tell you the story behind this building. Because craft gives us the ability to think about narratives that have to do with the making. This building is on a street called Floral Street. It's called Floral Street because here flowers were sold, and here in this very building, seeds of flowers were stockpiled and sold. So if you were a gardener in 18th, 19th century London, you would come here to get your seeds. And we were to reclad the building, which had its roots in an 1860 structure that had become dilapidated. And these are the panels that we made. But these panels were designed and devised to echo the forms of seeds. Seed pods, whether sunflowers, whether gourd-like seeds. We thought about the way seed structures were made. We drew that into a kind of abstracted, perfect ideal of a seedness, and then these were made into sculptures, which we tooled by hand, and then given to the producers who made them into some kind of a latex mold, and then the negative positive process produced these clay imprints, which are then glazed. We looked at glazes of all sorts of colors, but ended up with white as the kind of the greatest of all colors. And so in this building on Floral Street, we have given it a facade that has a meaning. It has the imprint of a sense of history that if anybody cares to think about, they might then go back and recapture as they walk through this part of London. It's the kind of thing Londoners love. You know, it's your history is your soul, is your past, is your present. And you see these here on the form of the building. Now, just around the corner, another piece of Covent Garden where we, so to speak, removed a tooth and put another in, is called King's Court. And it's a series of tiny little buildings inside the perimeter of listed facades. You see a courtyard here in a rendering, but this is then a photograph taken of the building and buildings. But at the end of the axis here, you see one of these little 5-story structures which we've made. Now, a great deal of this has to do with thinking about the brick. The brick had to somehow echo the proportions and the qualities of brick that pervades the whole of Covent Garden, which is a little bit of a miniature Roman brick in a way, long and not very tall. And I think in the end we had to go to Holland to get the brick, which is a little strange because we're trying to be authentically English. But still, this craft, along with the focus on the metalwork, which is a kind of a stamped metal of a very, very fine quality, gives us a modern architecture, but in some way its DNA says something about the history of the place of Covent Garden from which it comes. There's a little bit of a proto-industrial sense to the way these lintels are placed in the brick wall with metal windows placed inside of that. Now, terracotta, I wanted to include that as a little bit of a chapter. It's a very important material for contemporary architecture. It has experienced something of a renaissance. As you know, Renzo Piano was a great champion of this material type. Some of our first terracotta work happened in Beijing. It was actually a Chinese manufacturer of terracotta before it became more common. And I'll just mention it very briefly, but it's a screen which comes out in front of a set of buildings along the main Chang'an Boulevard, China Central Place. But it humanizes an otherwise very large-scale glass architecture. I think we have all gone, if I can proselytize, as architects, too far in the direction of resorting to glass as a solution for all building enclosures. At a certain point, it ceases to become the crisp and perfect way to let light in. It becomes the cheapest way to make an enclosure and the way to actually think very little about design, because you draw a grid and then a curtain wall manufacturer comes. So these screens were very, very important to give depth, give a sense of finery and human scale to a facade. But the building where I want to talk to you about terracotta is in New York City. This is about halfway up. This is a building I was privileged to work on the design of. This will be the tallest tower in Midtown Manhattan. It's known as One Vanderbilt, and it connects to the train station next door. You see this little wood model. The tiniest bit on the right-hand side is Grand Central Terminal, and on the left-hand side, we have this structure, which is mostly an office building. Now, it has various interesting properties. It connects to the train station underground. It performs, if you will, a bypass operation by taking transit loads that will double when East Side Access comes to Grand Central, bringing all Long Island ridership the possibility of coming into Grand Central. It's a very, very important building for us. It's about halfway up right now. And it rises to a very distinct point tower form at the top, which would be a series of public spaces for observation and entertainment and so on. And it's a building which makes a great space between itself and Grand Central. And sometimes the greatest public spaces can be quite little, but they provide a kind of tipping point importance for the place in which they make their precinct. This is actually the doorstep to Manhattan. So when you come out of the trains from Metro North, you come from Connecticut or Westchester or now from Long Island, this is where you come out the front door. So this little piece of formerly street, which becomes a public space, is maybe one of the most important things we will ever design. And here you see the connection of the building to Grand Central, underground. It's really a public-private partnership project of transit connection. And that's something we wish would happen more in the world, of a kind of a win-win collaboration between a city and a private developer where both benefit by this kind of sharing of space. But in the building itself, and you can see the way in which the diagonal movement from Grand Central comes into some zigzag escalators and forms of the base of the building. This was the building about 8 months ago, displaying a mighty series of cantilevers, which are there to create the public space. Below them is one has the liberty of moving around. It's an amazing piece of steel craft, you could say. But I want to draw your attention to the material of the wall. Now again, a building like this, one could say logically should just be a glass building, because at some 400 meters tall, it's got some rather large forces to deal with. Why would you add to the weight? Keep it clean, keep it simple, make it glass, and you're done. But we didn't feel that was appropriate, partly because, as you see on the left-hand side, those panels of the buildings that surround what we know as the Station District and what used to be called Terminal City originally, have a kind of a series of stories of the way that brick, terracotta, stamped metal, and stone were made into pictorial moments, little cartouches of interesting crafted arts. These are the handcraft arts that were part of that period of buildings 1910, 1920. So that on our building, we introduce a terracotta on a diagonal rake. The whole building has this diagonal theme that runs through its section, its top, and this slice that comes through the bottom of the building to liberate views towards Grand Central. So you could see in the mock-up here a terracotta paneling, which is made in upstate New York and costs quite a bit more to put up the building. This is not the developer's bottom line speaking loudly. It's a concession and an understanding that quality in building is something that is, in a way, a public benefit, if not to some degree, a little bit of a public right. We have the right to ask for buildings to have a certain sense of pride in themselves. Otherwise, what do our cities become? And so, those are big, lofty goals, but down to the basics, we're there to not only sculpt the forms for the terracotta, but we made 10 trips up to the factory to look at the glazes, the double glazes, the raku finishes, the little kind of gutters of more concentrated glazed paint in the center. Very, very careful attention that mostly my colleagues, Dorina Zlatieva and Rachel Villalta, spent their extra time going up to this factory to make sure that the terracotta was properly done. So that in the end, again, the theme of the diagonal appears in the detail, the macro appears in the micro. For those of you who studied Greek, you will know the term synecdoche. And synecdoche means when you see the big thing and the small thing and the small thing and the big thing. Well, that's very much in most of these examples that I'm showing you. You can see there's an echo of the larger strategy that is delighted in the detail. And here, in this case, the diagonal. And in a way, another echo, this recalls the diagonal geometries and the craft of the inside of Grand Central Terminal, made by a man named Guastavino, who was a Catalan engineer, fabricator, architect. He was a jack of all trades, came to New York between 1900 and 1920, made some of our most important buildings, but he didn't design the whole buildings, he designed the ceilings of cathedrals, train stations, other great buildings. And so we're recalling his ceilings in our building. So this gives us a way, again, to touch the history of the place in which we're making this, what we believe is a most important building. When we get to the top of the building, yes, the diagonals appear again. This time, the structure, this is an early conceptual model done during the competition, but we want very much the top to be a cage of steel that follows this kind of zigzagging towards the heavens. Wood is always an important material, has been forever. and actually gives us a chance to make a few things ourselves. It's an approachable, craftable material. We used it to a great degree in this building downtown in New York, known as Jackson Square, a little residential project of, you could see, 10 stories or so, completed about 7 years ago. The theme of the building had to do with the rippling of space, the rippling of a facade. We likened it to what happens when you put a rock, you see a rock in a stream and the water comes around it. That has to do with the urbanistic placement of the building. I won't go into that. But it resulted in a set of experiments with the form of the building in which we looked at many ways to wrap a rippling facade around this sort of angle L-shaped plan. And so you see this here looking up at this axonometric or perspective. But on the right-hand side is a little sort of exerted model of the entry to the building going back to the core. The core was way back from the entry to the building because of some structural issues having to do with trains underneath. And so our way of dealing with this was to make a kind of a casement of wood. And this was a great challenge. How are we going to make this kind of river ripple out of an inert material? Our way of doing it, and Trent Tesh, my partner, was working on this with his team, was to work with CNC machines in a group, today would be in Brooklyn, but it was a New Jersey sort of a craft wood group that found ways to stack and sequence the material and to break it down. This is almost like those pieces of Danish furniture makers' storeroom of pieces. And a lot of the success of this has to do with the understanding of how the sequencing of lamination is affected by and affects the perception of grain. Do we stack the grain this way, that way, the other way? Very, very important. And in the end, you could see now the influence of that river image. We found a way to get the grain to flow, even though it's created by a series of lamina that are going deeply into the body of the material, and then allowed us to sculpt this bamboo, it's a bamboo, so that what normally might be a handrail is actually integral to the wall itself. So, great moment of invention. I mean, you could say as important as the design of the larger building itself, and yielding then, in this long passageway, a kind of a pleasure that one would take of what otherwise could be seen as a chore. And then wood was brought also into the base of the building, street fronts where there were some sort of more artistic patterns of linear movement that were taken into panels behind glass. And then you see, just to finish on this project, the way the building curtain wall also ripples, but in a way that didn't call for curved glass. It didn't have to be perfect. A little bit of extra texture sometimes gives our craft more resonance. So in this case, the uneven faceting of the facade makes it all the more tactile. Glass, I was railing against glass a minute ago, but it's also a great, great material for us all and a material of our time. So this is actually another building for Ronnie Chan, a chance to work interestingly with glass. It's in Tianjin. It's a market building, otherwise known as a shopping mall, which is about 300 meters long. So it's a significant scale, and it wraps this unusual form around a body of concrete structure. And inside, the hoops of concrete create a kind of whalebone armature around which the glass is wrapped. The glass then is the exterior envelope, but it functions in many different ways. It is transparent glass, it is fritted glass, it is photovoltaic panels. These panels are also vents in some cases. So it's got 4 or 5 different functions, but geometrically, a big deal to try to regularize a really, really unusual form. And that form then gave us a result of over 3,000 panel sizes. So when you tell your client the typical wall has 3,000 types, you better make yourself scarce or you get shot because it just costs way, way too much. So the art then of geometry, of looking for kind of recombinant geometric analysis to take those 3,000 types down to 120 types made this possible. And thinking about it, we resorted to thinking about biomimicry, the way that the scales of a fish, the feathers of a bird come together to negotiate unusual shapes, lapping over each other, breathing to some degree, was very helpful in coming up with a solution, which then was applied over this structure with substructure and so on. You see a process photograph here, but a really great accomplishment. My colleague Jeff Kenoff led this design, and visits to the Yuanda factory in Shenyang, part of the deal. So, you know, you find yourself as architects going back and forth to site. It's one of the greatest, the only ways to learn about architecture is actually be on the site. And I think that's something either you've all experienced or it awaits you in your careers, but you know, something you really want to do as much as you can. Aluminum craft, now to move from glass to another relatively modern material. I'll just mention a project in Shanghai. This is the Jing'an Carry Center, and it's a building of sizable scale, but it's made up of a collage of much smaller elements, smaller volumes. So we build up a series of boxes to make a larger whole, and that has to do with an urban agenda of humanizing what otherwise becomes intimidating scale. But the way in which each of those boxes is made is of a series of variety of wall types, of stone, of terracotta, and when it comes to the aluminum glass, of different modules that create a kind of ascending scale of double squares, 2 times that double square. It's all a kind of a geometric game of regular ascending scales. And the whole thinking about the project has to do with combining from the smallest scale below to the largest scale above, a Fibonacci series of sweeping up from the ground to the top of the sky. But within that collection of boxes is a tiny little box here that you see lit sort of in the foreground. It's the Michael Kors store. Now Michael Kors, you might know, kind of a middle-level American fashion brand. He happens to have his office next to ours on 42nd Street in New York. So seeing his people come in and out of the elevator every day, eventually they came to us or we came to them and they said, we have this shop in Shanghai, can you help us? Michael wants something with bling. So he's apparently the master of bling, meaning this better have some really interesting light properties. And so, and here he is with some of his favorite models. And he's a pretty demanding guy because, you know, he does achieve great success. And I'm not sure why, or he probably doesn't know why, but he's very good at it. And so we had to be good at our trade. And our trade was to show him we could come up with a surface, and he didn't know what it was. He said, make it out of leather, make it out of glass, make it out of cheese, I don't care, make it sparkle. And so we investigated different types of aluminum. We looked at the spectral qualities of aluminum that had a titanium coating, aluminum that had printed profiles. The whole idea was if we could analyze the way light came off the aluminum, we would maximize the way you experience this bling. So we not only chose the material, then we decided we would script a set of profiles. So my colleague Mark Nickel, who's very clever and teaches at the University of Pennsylvania, classes in coding, essentially, of building geometries, thought about sequencing of forms. And he resorted to thinking about music. Music is about sequences. Sequences that go up and down like scales and arpeggios. They surprise us and they delight us. But then this became his sort of script, which is really Greek to me. But apparently this helped him to figure out how he would make this material and make these profiles that were then mass manufactured. And again, this code took various forms. This is the craft of the current day. And I'll end in a few minutes on the topic of digital craft. But here, it was, to me, a wonderful little exercise in, it's almost like writing music. And you know, we all know the cliche about frozen music. But it is kind of, now it's unfrozen here. And so, and you know, it is interesting, this subject of music and architecture, because music is temporal, and architecture is, but it isn't. Because architecture is frozen, but then we move through architecture. So is it about time or not? Is literature about time? Thomas Mann said about music that it truly moves over your experience, where his novels were fixed. Architecture is somewhere in between. And so, back to my friend Mark Nickel, he scripted this beautiful stuff, created some panels, made some prototypes, held them up. Michael Kors came by, his staff were petrified, he rejected, he said, "Fabulous!" And it was approved. It was one word meeting. And there it is. And so this little piece of the cube of Jing'an, which is a gigantic project of 2.5 million square feet, one little piece becomes the kind of triumph of the architecture of making. We can see it in the distance. I'm sorry I don't show it in a movie here. That's where you'd see the sparkling and the glinting and the thing coming to life. Steelcraft, a little harder than aluminum, harder to fashion, but longer lasting. We completed, and my colleague again, Trent Tesh, completed a museum of the automobile, of historic automobiles in LA. And of course, the car itself is a sculpture. I don't know if this is an old Mercedes, probably is. But from the slipstreaming of the testing of the wind properties of cars to the making of their hoods and bonnets and stripes, there's a wonderful set of themes to work with. So this museum became a kind of application of a series of metal strips and waves over an existing box that was painted red. So the sketches, which first evoked, really in a very intuitive way, a sense of movement, then had to be transformed into something that we could make it from. Process of making was a challenge here. And we had to think not only about how these forms could be cut and supported, but how they would wrap and fold in 3 dimensions, and they could be given internal substructures, and then those could be put together with rivets, and they could be shipped to site and painted and then applied, and the application was done in a very precisely matching way of up maximum 3 points, sometimes two points per panel, and then put onto this box. So the whole process of erection took only a couple of weeks. But the most cool thing is that you see those seams with kind of a blue tape. This building wouldn't work if you saw the seams. So the notion of craft here is about erasing the sign of making. It's covering up the hand or the machine to try to achieve a kind of perfection. So this became this. So in the end, like a car body, unless you're looking at a place where the bonnet is picked up or the door is opened, there is no seam. And that's in the beauty of the making of this piece. And the strategy and the intelligence of my colleagues, I have to say, as they came up with these ideas. And it wasn't really, you could say, their idea. It was shared with a company called Zanger, which is the manufacturer. So at this stage of work, the people who are with you in the factory, they are as much authors of the architecture as you are the architect. And that's something which doesn't take away from your credit or your feeling of satisfaction. It only makes you more proud of what you're doing because you're sharing with somebody who has a different line of work, a different walk of life. So let me finish now with something which I'll call future craft, which is probably coming closer to what many of you are doing today than what I personally can add to or understand. Because I'm a dinosaur. I draw by hand, I make clay models, and I admire the cybercraft of my colleagues. Some are younger, and that's maybe one reason why. So, but we think of the making of architecture from, well, there's Michelangelo on one side, to I'm not sure which scholar, maybe a Ming Dynasty scholar, to someone like Daniel Burnham, but to today, where we hear the click, almost the silent click of the keyboard. And so this is a very, very interesting project. This is not a KPF project. This is done by one of our collaborators, a man named David Benjamin. He's an architect, taught at Yale, but went off into a field of making. And making is a word that has a resonance today. We associate with the more creative parts of our cities, such as in New York, Brooklyn, London, Clerkenwell, or Shoreditch. You know, the place where if you graduate from college and you don't have a big-time job, you can find a rent, maybe still in Brooklyn, it's gotten expensive, but you can buy yourself some time to start experimenting. And then maybe you can rub 2 coins together and make $1 and make a living. So what this guy, David Benjamin, did was he was so smart with geometries, and he was interested in structure, that he made what this little thing you see in front of you is actually an airplane part. So he was interested in optimizing the weight to strength ratio of materials, of plastics, of metals, and these would be achieved by printing, not by a machine with spinning, grinding wheels or saws. And so he got a contract with not Boeing, but Airbus, to make airplane parts. He would reduce the weight by 50%. Now, if an airplane can reduce a significant aspect of its parts by 50% in weight, that's a lot of jet fuel every year. These planes fly, as we know, long, long distances. So what he did was to work with structural engineers to optimize a form that had no regularity at all. These might look like regular square tubes, but the sort of honeycomb thickness and gauge of each of these pieces from one length to the other is completely different. You know, more like a bird's wing bone, or an insect carapace, or a leaf of a tree. You know, these are organic forms. And so, because you can now print, you could make objects of almost infinite complexity without the extra cost of labor. And so now this guy Benjamin has this wonderful business making airplanes from his loft somewhere in Brooklyn. He'll go back to architecture. He's doing interesting buildings, but this overlap, or the blurring of the line between the maker and the designer, I think is a wonderful thing for your generation, maybe my generation, because I get to watch and participate in our firm in such things, which we are now bringing into our work. And yesterday, I was with a fellow in Dubai, speaking at a conference, who was showing me his printed building. It's not a small building, it's not 100 stories, but it's like a one-story building. It could fill the first story of this hall, and it's all printed. So, machine technologies of fabrication can now influence our thinking. But to move one step further with this future craft, I want to show you the work of a fellow in our firm, Luke Wilson, and his colleagues. Came from Columbia about 5 years ago. He'd done a combined degree in mathematics, computer science, and architecture. And he was really interested in the geometries and the limits that describe the way buildings fit into cities, essentially urbanism. So he would then prescribe in his analysis many iterations of building form, which could then lead us to the best selection of the optimal design. He was with us today in a presentation we made to Tencent of a new city, showing them, and quite a savvy information technology company, you could say, how his wares of number analysis can lead to optimized design. I have to say they were quite impressed. I hope they were. But he uses this to describe all sorts of things. These little sort of circle charts explain graphically how, when you move through a map of the city, which you see in the bullseye in the center, mixed uses are experienced, with blue as office and yellow as retail and orange as residential. The experience of the mix of city purposes. And it's visual, but it uses data, so we can begin to then go to any neighborhood where our buildings are found or going to be, and we can understand better what they're made out of. This sort of diagram that he makes going down a spine of a city, I believe it's Broadway or something like it, is showing something to do with building values. Well, economics are a very important part of making cities. And so the analysis of the economics of a corridor becomes something that aids us in making our decisions. In this part of, I have to remember which city this is in, but he's going through, Luke is going through passageways of a route, a promenade through the city, and he's trying to understand the view cones that one experiences of the space. Now, this is very important to the owner of a large precinct for the purposes of understanding where retail could best be located, because your eyeballs falling on the storefronts, that makes a valuable retail position for a shop. So that's a form of analysis. Or taking that and extending that idea to the interior of a larger sequence of spaces. We could see here, as you walk through corridors in a market space, the different visibilities of the buildings around you. So almost every day, Luke is coming up with different tools. They're created, they're suited to different functions of thinking. It's not, it's not, a guy with the saw and the file and the ad. This guy has thousands of tools. He comes up to me and says, I made a new tool today for you because you've got a new project that has different needs. Thank you, Luke. And his thinking was very instrumental in, I would say, shaping some significant city projects that we've been involved with in the recent 5 years. This is a model of Earl's Court, which is, again, another size of project equivalent to a ducal estate in West London. And what Luke is doing is to manipulate in the urban design parameters of street width and building height to show how one influences the other, and ultimately the public realm can be analyzed. How much light do we get down to the street, to the park space? And so our belief is that this kind of thinking is going to become more and more a standard tool with which we work, not an exotic kind of application. And to finish up with a few final images, and this is one image which comes from a project that we're now building in Shenzhen, known as Terra. But this kind of positioning of building, of pedestrian routes, of transport routes, is arrived at through this digital analysis. The digital analysis does not design the building, doesn't design the space. It's a tool to which we react to. Your hand, your brain governs the course of making the architecture. The tool is the thing that you use to leverage, to make you more powerful in making something physically, but also to make you more intellectually capable to come up with a design that would, in this case, maximize through the separating of the section and the replicating of the ground plane to maximize the interaction between people who work in one space, might go to a coffee shop in another space, or live in yet another. And so this analysis, which was what we brought to Tencent today, was telling them, we can optimize the length of your routes between this part of your company and that part of your company. That doesn't mean shorten them to the smallest degree, because we should walk every day. There's a reason why your stair here is a wonderful thing, because it gets the heart pumping a little bit. We don't want to be transported from one place to another, and we'll turn out, to be, overweight blobs with no love of life. But this kind of, his inputs can have to do with health, with proximity. He inputs varieties of experience, so we can say, in your day you should have this percentage of time in a small cluster working on your key projects, but that percentage of time being in a market space with people you've never met before, because your mind needs that kind of refreshing. So these are intuitive ideas. We all understand this in urban design, but they're being quantified. And I show you this as a very nice, I believe, picture which just summarizes what he's able to help us to achieve. So last image is an image of one of our buildings designed by my partner Hugh Trumbull in New Jersey. It's a building that was quite an ugly two-story, almost wreck of an old office building. It's completely transformed. As they say, the most sustainable building is the existing building. You don't tear it down, you do something with it. But you could see here a joy in the crafting of wood, of baguettes of stone set in a dark matrix, rather simple geometry and use of building, but given a kind of a spirit by the textures given to the building. And I think this building and those that come well before it remind us that our most important responsibility as architects is to think what will be around long after we're gone. It has to do with the way in which buildings are made to withstand time. They're given a longevity, but they're also given a beauty that can be understood by those people whom we will never meet. Because when we can make things, when we can see the evidence of our hands, of our brains, often of our collaborative efforts, it's communicated by buildings. Buildings talk to us. We certainly feel that when we walk through Covent Garden, when we walk through Soho in New York, when we walk up on Hollywood Road, or we would walk through Shincheonji. It's really not always the big moves, the grand compositional geometries. It's often the way things are made that it gives us a kind of abiding quality and character of architecture. And if we can bestow that on those, our kids and their following generations, then it's the most valuable thing that we can do, for our society. So that's our little story, and thanks for listening. I hope there's some questions from the audience.